Evil and suffering is a big one, and I'd be interested in your perspectives on that. You hear people say that particularly the Abrahamic God, who's all-powerful and all-knowing and all good, and you've just made a reference to that yourself, the locus of all good things.
Yes.
Now, there's the atheistic argument from evil, and it basically runs that if there is such a God, and I don't want to sound unsympathetic about this, it's a big challenge. Evil is a big problem. Just as I described exists, then there'd be no evil or suffering, but there is a lot of evil and suffering in the world. Therefore, there can't be a God, or certainly not a Christian God.
Yes, that is basically the problem of evil, and it's an argument that I'll bring out if somebody is talking about how God is good all the time and all the time God is good. In general, I don't use the argument. However, apologists like William Lane Craig, as well as that Muslim apologist that we covered recently, seem to really want to focus on the problem of evil right now. I don't know if there was some seminar somewhere that talked about the problem of evil, and so everybody's like concerned about it, but whatever. Today, we're going to hear from William Lane Craig about why the problem of evil is not a problem at all. So, if you want to fuck around and find out why William Lane Craig doesn't consider the problem of evil to be all that much of a problem at all, then please stay tuned. What's up, heathens? How y'all doing? I'm the Godless Engineer, and I critically analyze apologist claims to give you the best arguments and information so that you can stand up and use your voice. Like I said, today we're going to be taking a look at William Lane Craig answering the problem of evil. And he has a very unique way of answering it. I feel like it's still important to cover the problem of evil and how each apologist handles it, because while they do handle it in different ways, like I said, they all ultimately use the same kind of logic, showing that this logic permeates all of apologetics when it comes to questioning whether or not God is actually good and how integral that is to the definition of someone's God. So let's get on into the video and see how Dr. William Lane Craig answers the problem of evil.
So where do philosophers in general come out on that question of suffering, and where do you land?
Well, historically, for centuries, atheistic philosophers have defended the view that the existence of the suffering and evil in the world is logically incompatible with the existence of God.
Yes, I would definitely agree with that. As long as you only consider the omnibenevolent definitions of God. If omnibenevolence is a major part of your definition of what it means to be God, or who your God is, then definitely the problem of evil stands in the way of him being, or her, being real. The fact that you call this God omnibenevolent and then also say that this God created things, or this God has any kind of pull in this world, or does anything in this world tangible, something real that supposedly happens. I feel like if that God were to exist, then all of the unnecessary suffering in this world wouldn't happen. Like tornadoes killing people. It doesn't mean that tornadoes can't exist as some physical phenomena, but just the fact that tornadoes would kill some of God's most ardent believers for just living in one particular area on this earth, while we understand it from a scientific perspective, from an omnibenevolent magical God perspective, it kind of leaves us wondering, why would God do this? Why would God allow this? This seems like needless suffering. If God has a plan for us, or he has some reason as to why he's allowing this to happen, and he's like all-knowing, then why can't he figure out a way to accomplish whatever task in a better way that doesn't include the suffering of the people that believe in him? So logically, yes, it doesn't make sense for unnecessary evil or unnecessary suffering to exist in this world if your God is all-knowing, all-powerful, and omnibenevolent, which rules out the Abrahamic God, and that pretty much attacks the three of the biggest religions that exist right now, including Christianity.
And now on the contemporary scene, this has really changed. Virtually no one defends the logical version of the problem of evil anymore. And the reason is that it lays upon the shoulders of the atheist a burden of proof that is so heavy that no one has been able to sustain it. The atheists would have to prove that there is no logically possible reason that God could have for permitting the evil and suffering in the world.
Well, first of all, for the claim that nobody argues for the logical incoherence of evil existing along with an omnibenevolent God, I mean, I think that that's probably the stronger part of the argument. The fact that God's supposed to be omnibenevolent, but there's all this unnecessary suffering. I feel like that's a pretty big, logical flaw in this construction of an Abrahamic God. So I'm gonna need a fucking citation that nobody argues for the illogicalness of evil existing in light of an omnibenevolent God. I mean, I just laid out in this video how it is illogical. So I feel like that's still going around. That still makes sense. Maybe Dr. Craig can enlighten us on how it's not illogical to consider that God allows evil to happen, but yet he's still an omnibenevolent God. Also, something that I'd probably bring up before I bring up the problem of evil is all of the evil shit that God does just because he can. Like in the Old Testament, there was a group of Israelites that was getting a little lippy, a little uppity and everything. And God just creates a sarlacc pit and has it swallow them whole. Like, you couldn't think of a better way to resolve that confrontation, God? You just had to completely erase them off the map with a sarlacc pit? Seriously? And then there's the whole killing of all the firstborn of Egypt. You seriously couldn't think about a way to resolve that confrontation without killing innocent children? Really? I feel like if any God is omnibenevolent, he's not going to do shit like that. He would figure out whatever way he could how to accomplish his task without needlessly killing children. And I could go on and on and on with all of the evil shit that happens in the Bible that if God were omnibenevolent, he definitely wouldn't do. So the problem of evil extends far past what we experience in reality today. Obviously, there is unnecessary evil that happens, unnecessary suffering that happens that God allows, and there doesn't seem to be anything good to come of it. But the problem of evil extends into their own theological work, the Bible, because God does a lot of evil shit. He commands a lot of evil shit on top of allowing a lot of evil shit to happen in the Bible. So I feel like the illogicalness of evil and suffering is pervasive throughout the entire idea of an Abrahamic God.
And no one can prove such a thing. So those who do defend the problem of evil today have retreated from the logical version of the problem to the so-called probabilistic version of the problem, where the claim is that given the evil and suffering in the world, it's improbable that God exists, if not impossible.
I like how Dr. Craig here has to formulate this in a way that it makes atheists look like we're somehow admitting a loss on something and regrouping and figuring out how this evil issue is still fucking up their worldview. I mean, to suggest that atheists have somehow lost the argument, or that people critical of Abrahamic religions have somehow lost an argument here, is just peak straw man from Dr. Craig. I feel like it's kind of like one of those times where if you say something enough and you present it publicly to people and you refuse to acknowledge that what you're saying doesn't match reality, then you sort of make it a reality. Like, people just start believing that this is true. Like, nobody's using the problem of evil. It's been defeated on the logical front, and now they have to retreat to this particular offshoot of the problem of evil. I don't care how much Dr. Craig says that we've lost an argument. That's not going to make it true. But regardless of that, the probabilistic argument for God, I feel like, extends far outside the problems of evil and suffering. True, I think that the problem of evil and suffering does factor into a probabilistic argument for the God of Abraham, the Abrahamic God. But the argument about the probability of that God existing, it definitely includes a whole lot more illogical arguments or illogical things about the God combined with the Bible in particular, because we're talking to Dr. Craig, a Christian. So, I mean, while the problem of evil does factor into that, I don't think that it's the only argument as far as like a probabilistic argument against the Abrahamic God. Because just for instance, if I were to make an argument based on how likely the Abrahamic God is to have existed or does exist, then I would probably pull from all of the illogical statements that the Bible makes, the fact that Genesis doesn't represent real history, the fact that the Israelite history contained in the Old Testament doesn't really comport with actual history that we know about. And then there's the New Testament that doesn't comport with the actual history of first century Palestine and everything. The fact that just all of these things that have culminated in me not believing in the Abrahamic God leads me to a probabilistic argument that this God probably doesn't exist. It's very unlikely that he exists, and the problem of evil and suffering is only a small portion of that.
And the difficulty with this version of the problem is that it makes probability judgments that are simply beyond our ability. There is no basis for thinking that if God has morally sufficient reasons for permitting the evil and suffering in the world, that these should be evident to me.
Now, for some minor types of suffering, or maybe minor types of evil, I guess by any kind of Christian standard, I feel like those are easily explainable by, oh, well, God could allow this to happen and, something good could come of it. Just because you're suffering a little bit or suffering some hardships or something like that doesn't mean that there isn't a good reason for it, or that there's some kind of good outcome that can't come from this, right? You learn something, you grow as a person. Just because you struggled in life doesn't mean that struggle is inherently evil or anything like that. I'm not expecting a utopia from God, but what I am expecting is needless suffering to disappear, or to not even be here in the first place. The fact that children are born addicted to drugs is a real big issue for me. The fact that there are kids with cancer. Why would God need somebody in the womb, knit together somebody in the womb, have the mother go through the pregnancy, give birth to the child, have the child live for a couple of years, only to get bone cancer or any other kind of cancer or any other kind of sickness or illness? Why is that? If you're going to sit there and tell me that there's a good reason that child got it, that child had cancer, I'm going to need you to explain it. And you cannot just sit there and be like, oh, well, only God knows. I'm sorry, but I'm far more moral than your God if you think that there's a good reason for children to die at the age of 4 through a horrible disease like cancer or any other kind of genetic disease or illness. I mean, you're just not going to convince me that there's a good reason why that child had to suffer like that. That would be needless suffering. The fact that there are thousands of children that die of hunger. What is that? Like, why is that a thing that happens if this omnibenevolent God exists and he's all knowing, he's all powerful, but he's not powerful enough to give a kid a cracker, to throw a fucking peanut butter bottle and at the feet of somebody that's hungry? Like, he can't do that. He can't manifest that. He just can't, wiggle his nose and shake his dick and make that situation just not exist. Really? If you're going to sit there and tell me that God has all these properties that make him fantastical and awesome and something that should be feared, then you're going to need to explain to me why he doesn't do these things. Why he does do these things. Like in the Bible, in Numbers 31, why does he command the Israelites to go in and kill small children, specifically the boys, because they can't get pregnant? The prepubescent girls that haven't known the touch of a man, he obviously wants the Israelites to force them into sexual slavery. Yes, that is sexual slavery. Hey, here's another good question. Why does fucking sexual slavery exist in the Bible? That seems like unnecessary suffering to me. I feel like that is definitely something that this world can do without, and that God could definitely figure out a situation around that to where that just simply doesn't exist. See, I could go on and on and on for days with the number of problems that this omnibenevolent God produces when we consider the world that we live in.
For example, every event that occurs in human history sends a ripple effect through history, such that God's morally sufficient reasons for permitting it might not emerge until centuries from now, perhaps in another country. An illustration of this would be the so-called butterfly effect in contemporary physics. It's been shown that the fluttering of a butterfly's wings on a twig in West Africa can set in motion forces that will eventually produce a hurricane over the Atlantic Ocean. And yet no one watching that little butterfly on the branch could possibly predict such an outcome. These kinds of probability judgments are just beyond our capacity.
Really? Okay, we're going to get to the butterfly effect thing here in a second. Let's handle the very first part of what he's talking about here. So, you're trying to tell me that God is all-knowing, he's omnibenevolent, all-powerful, that God can't figure out a way to make the ripples ripple in similar ways to produce the same kind of effect in time. So, like, he's saying that, oh, well, we can't know what ripple effect this one particular event, this event of suffering or this event of evil has on this world. And it may be centuries later that some kind of good comes from it. Never mind the fact that he seems like he's just pushing it off as like, oh, don't worry about it. Something good is going to come about, by it. I just know that that's going to happen without actually having any kind of evidence to prove that that's going to happen. But you're trying to tell me that God is, at the same time, God is all-knowing, but also not knowing enough. So you're going to sit there and tell me that God, at the exact same time as being all-knowing, is also not smart enough to figure out some other configuration of events that would end up with ripples that end up accomplishing the thing that he wanted to accomplish? Seriously? If he's all-knowing, then it seems like he would be able to do that. Because I can guarantee you, any event in history that happens that eventually comes to fruition does not necessarily need suffering attached to it in order to accomplish it. You can get to that particular end by some other means that doesn't include whatever kind of evil or suffering that you have in mind. Him saying that you just simply can't know the probability of this works both ways. Because he doesn't know the probability of an alternate solution that would accomplish the same thing with the suffering. We're not saying that you need to forego the good end result of things. We're saying that you can get to those results without causing suffering along the way. That's what we're saying. Now let's get to this butterfly effect thing, because that was supremely stupid right there. First of all, the butterfly effect is something in chaos theory, which is more of a mathematical model rather than something in contemporary physics. Although chaos theory is used in physics on occasion, chaos theory is more of a mathematical thing. That's why Ian Malcolm is a mathematician, not a physicist. But this whole butterfly causing a hurricane or tornado thing has a bit of a weird past. For one thing, Edward Norton Lawrence came up with this whole concept in order to explain chaos theory in simple terms. Ultimately, it's meant to convey that small changes in the inputs to some large complex system can have very large effects on the system. And so that's what it's meant to illustrate. Initially, Lawrence actually came up with a seagull causing a storm. Like a seagull flapping its wings causes a storm somehow because of the minute changes in the atmosphere or whatever. But he was convinced to make it a bit more poetic and go with butterfly and hurricane. Now, this is a far cry from it being proven by contemporary physics that butterflies cause hurricanes to cross the Atlantic. So no, Dr. Craig, maybe stick to your lane, because mathematics is definitely not fucking one of them. But that being said, small changes to the inputs could have very large effects on the outcomes of some large complex system. So could there be a good reason why some kind of evil or suffering ends up occurring in history in this large complex system we call reality? Sure. Good outcomes can be seen as happening, resulting from episodes of suffering or evil. But that doesn't mean that those outcomes are only arrived at through suffering and evil. That is the fatal flaw of Dr. Craig's argument here. He assumes that the only way to get to that outcome is through the suffering and evil that occurs, and God knows that. He's playing off of a perceived ignorance of mathematics and probabilities that we cannot make a probabilistic guess as to how likely it is some outcome can be achieved by suffering and by not suffering. It's just far too complex. We just simply don't know if one exists without the other. See, the thing is that when you're dealing with such a large set, even if it's a minute percent, like it's a very small probability, that still means that it's likely. And given the complex nature of reality, I can guarantee you that you can get from point A to point B without any suffering involved. But that's the beauty of working from the idea that God is all-knowing, God is perfect, because that sets up this entire situation. That sets up who is controlling all of this? Well, God is. Well, what are the properties of God? He's perfect. He's all-knowing. He's the smartest motherfucker alive. He knows all information. He also knows the future. He knows how our actions are going to affect his reality that he has created. Okay. Does that mean that he would be smart enough to figure out paths that don't include suffering? Well, considering that the probabilistic nature of paths with suffering versus paths without suffering is some non-zero amount, then yes, God should be able to find really quickly the path through all of that from point A to point B without suffering. He should be able to find that, pinpoint it, and cause it to happen. See, this is a problem that is only a problem because of how Christians have defined their God.
And similarly, when we see some instance of suffering and evil in the world, we are simply not in a position to say with any sort of confidence, God probably doesn't have a morally sufficient reason for permitting that to occur.
Well, so saying that God probably doesn't have a good reason for that to occur is different than saying the path that doesn't include suffering exists. If God is benevolent, then he should choose that path. That's contained, that whole idea is contained in the part that's omnibenevolent. And now again, what we're defining as suffering and evil and all this is the unnecessary suffering and evil that happens. The things that we in fact know happen today that don't really have any kind of good outcomes, that don't, have any purpose whatsoever. That would be the unnecessary evil that we're talking about. In the vast spectrum of different paths that can be taken in this reality, there exists a non-zero amount of paths that include this unnecessary evil and suffering, and paths that don't include that unnecessary evil and suffering. So, God being all-knowing and all-powerful, immediately, he would know the path needed to be taken in order for no suffering to occur. The fact that God doesn't choose to do that means that God is not omnibenevolent.
A second point that needs to be made here is that when one's talking about probabilities, then you've also got to consider on the other side of the scale, what is the probability that God does exist? And here I would offer multiple considerations that I think make it quite probable that there is, in fact, a transcendent creator and designer of the universe, despite any improbability that the suffering in the world might throw upon the existence of God.
Well, now, I feel like Dr. Craig has kind of moved the goalposts a little bit here, because transcendent, creator being is not exactly the full definition of the Christian God. Now, whether that is a transcendent being that transcends reality, or just some, deity that exists out there. Hell, it could even be a theistic deity where it's a personal interaction between the believer and the God. Just because there's a personal interaction, or there's this transcendent factor in God, that doesn't necessarily mean that he's described as being omnibenevolent. The only way that the problem of evil should be used is when you're arguing against an omnibenevolent definition. And I guess specifically, this omnibenevolent God would also have to be all-knowing in order for the problem of evil to really hold water against it. It's a very niche sort of argument here, which definitely can be used against Abrahamic religions, because their God is defined as omnibenevolent, all-knowing, all-powerful, all those omni attributes. And so with all those attributes and evil exists, sure, that God does not exist. But if you're just talking about some transcendent God that, may or may not be omnibenevolent, if you're not defining that trait, then the problem of evil is really not going to affect whether or not that God exists. So I feel like Dr. Craig has sort of shifted the goalposts here in what he's actually talking about, because he's no longer talking about specifically the Abrahamic God or the Christian God. He's more broadly talking about a general transcendent creator being, which there are plenty of those that exist in other religions that don't include omnibenevolent gods.
Interestingly, I've never forgotten the story, a true story, about a young university student in Scotland, not long after, well, probably, I suspect, during the Depression years. Things were grim. And he knocked on the door. It was open, of a small cottage that was opened. There was a returned serviceman from the First World War. And when he realized the young man wanted to talk to him about God, he said, "Go away." He said, "I was in the trenches in France, and I stopped believing in God when I saw all that evil." And the young man said to him, "I respect that must have been terrible, and I certainly won't pest you, but can I just make the observation that I wonder if I'd been there, I might not have stopped believing in man rather than stopped believing in God."
Well, why would you stop believing in man? I mean, I guess it's a bit of an equivocation here, because believing in man versus believing in God are two totally different things. Because believing in man, I feel like that has the connotation of believing in the goodness of men, believing in that people will choose to do the right thing over the wrong thing. And I definitely don't believe in my fellow man like that. Now, individuals, sure, there are a few individuals that I feel would, choose to do the right thing over the wrong thing. And I try to keep those people close to me. But as far as like comparing that to believing in God, I don't think so. It's not the same thing, because saying that you don't believe in God because there's this evil that exists in the world and you don't know how to make heads or tails of it, because if this God is omnibenevolent, like I've been taught all of my life, then why is he allowing kids to have bone cancer? Why is he allowing the Nazis to kill my friend over here in the trench? Or in World War I, it was still the Germans that were fighting, the other side. But still, you get my point here, is that not believing in a God, because you find all of these unnecessary things that happen in our reality, but yet they still happen. They cause suffering. They are considered evil. And God just sits back in his lazy boy and he watches it and he masturbates. I think that's a totally legit reason not to believe in God. But I do want to offer a counterexample to the host's example here of being in the trenches, knocking on the door and everything like that. And that's this quote from Primo Levi, an Auschwitz survivor. And he said, "There is Auschwitz, and so there cannot be God." And in that picture that I showed, that was actually a meme, a picture that I created for a Facebook page long ago. But those are just piles of eyeglasses from all of the people that were killed at Auschwitz. The fact that unnecessary suffering happened, that evil happened, and God did nothing whatsoever to save his chosen people, which that's not the first time it's happened either. It's happened multiple times in the Old Testament of God seemingly abandoning his chosen people, or even hiring mercenaries basically to come in and enslave his chosen people just because they were worshiping other gods, or they allowed other people to worship gods within their own cities and everything. I feel like that is definitely not an omnibenevolent God.
Yeah.
And the old man looked at him, tears welled up in his eyes, and he said, "You better come in. We need to talk about this."
Yeah.
It's an interesting take on evil. I sometimes think that one of our problems is that we're not self-reflective enough about
Yes,
our own nature and our own
certainly
flawed.
one of the major developments in philosophy with respect to this problem is the so-called free will defense, in which philosophers, I think, have been able to show that it's neither improbable nor impossible that every world that God would create that would involve this much good, this much moral goodness, would also involve this much moral evil freely perpetrated by human free agents. So that
now, on a naturalistic worldview, I agree. These kind of evils or suffering, they exist just because they do exist. Now, I'm not so much buying into the whole idea that like, oh, well, this good exists, therefore this evil must exist. I don't think that that particular statement holds a lot of water, because I don't see as, oh, well, good things exist, therefore bad things also have to exist. I feel like good things could exist, and that's mutually exclusive from bad things existing. Of course, this is all talking about the subjective view of classifying good and bad thof You could argue that then, if all this unnecessary suffering was out of the picture, that didn't happen, then all of the things that were good would then be further broken down into, well, this is good over here, and now we're considering this to be bad or evil or something like that. So maybe I could see a perpetual like classification, but I mean, still, that's all in our own heads. That's all subjectively done by us. It's not like this is some God that's causing evil or anything like that, because it's just nature. In nature, everything's amoral. Well, nature's amoral, and it doesn't care about the suffering of conscious creatures or the things that we would call evil in this world. Nature is just there. Under the idea of an omnibenevolent God, though, that with this magical power to influence the actions of people or influence what happens in this world or create things at the drop of a hat, I don't think that it makes a lot of sense. Do you?
Ultimately, the blame lies at man's threshold and not at God's.
As far as classifying things as good and bad, evil, and everything like that, I would agree that it's up to us to classify those things. Somebody could see something as bad or suffering, and that same suffering or evil could be seen as neutral or maybe even good to somebody else. So this classification of good and bad and evil is really subjective. Now, as far as suffering goes, I feel like we can concretely define suffering and in a way that's objective. And so I don't think that you can just get away with saying, oh, ultimately it's up to man, or it's man's responsibility and how we perceive things. Of course, that's not what Dr. Craig's talking about. What Dr. Craig's talking about is that it's our own free will that creates all this evil, because God is so loving, he allows us to have free will. And so that means that some people are just going to do evil things. But if God really is all powerful and all knowing, then don't you think that he would create people or make it so that people just didn't cause those pieces of unnecessary suffering? But even so, the pieces of unnecessary suffering that I've brought up today are things that are not necessarily caused by people. These are things that are unnecessary and uncaused by others, like children having bone cancer or having some kind of genetic disease or something like that. There's nobody that is to blame for that, because it's just there. Well, barring the nuances of, anything that does cause those things, I'm just talking about them just happening in general, not because of some chemical that was in the water or something like that. You understand what I'm saying? Well, heathens, that's going to be it for Dr. William Lane Craig's video today. I was not all that impressed with his argumentation against the problem of evil. He just kind of seems to brush it aside and say, oh, well, we're not smart enough to know the good reasons why this is happening, but you can be assured that there are good reasons for this to happen. But he says this in light of saying, oh, well, we just can't know that there aren't good reasons. If you're going to say that, then I feel like you also have to say, well, we can't know if there are good reasons for that to happen. But he seems to be pretty hard up on establishing that there are good reasons because God is omnibenevolent. At the same time, though, you can use that particular argument against him by saying, oh, well, if God is omnibenevolent, then he definitely doesn't need to cause this unnecessary suffering. So any way that Craig goes about it, there's still a problem of suffering, and it's definitely detrimental to the Abrahamic God. Well, heathens, I really appreciate you stopping by and watching the video today. If you will, please go down below, leave us a comment, let us know what you thought about William Lane Craig's argument here. And hey, while you're down there, why don't you smash that like button and subscribe if you like this kind of content. Don't forget to stand up and use your voice. Bye, heathens.